Well, it's L.A.
Bounces, gets it back.
Go for the dump.
There's nothing but love between those two.
He's fucking nuts is not the kind of thought people expect from Shaquille O'Neal, but 6 players found ways to make the NBA's biggest bully feel nervous. Shaq stood 7'1". At his heaviest, he weighed more than 325 pounds. He was not just big, he was fast, explosive, and strong enough that entire teams changed their game plans just to survive him. Coaches told their players to foul him on purpose because that was easier than trying to stop him near the basket. He won 4 championships, he won 3 finals MVP awards, he won 1 regular season MVP. He made the All-Star team 15 times. On paper, he looks like a man who never blinked. And if this look behind the myth already has you hooked, use the hype feature and give this video some hype as we get into the names that made Shaq doubt himself. Because underneath the highlight reels, Shaq admitted something most fans never expected. He got nervous, he got scared, he got shaky hands and a pounding heart, just like anyone else. 6 players reached him in 6 different ways. One made him feel like a fan meeting his hero, another made him feel like an untested rookie about to be embarrassed on national TV. One made him invent a lie just so he could feel angry enough to compete. One taught him a lesson he did not see coming until it was too late. And 2 players who never matched his size still found a way to make him feel lost on defense. How could a 7'1", 325-pound force who made teams build rosters around fouling him be frightened by anyone? He was not supposed to feel small next to anyone. He was built to be the immovable object, the center every other team had to plan around before they even walked into the arena. Yet by his own words, some nights he felt more like a nervous kid than the most feared man in basketball. The answer starts with the one name Shaq always brings up first. The man he once watched from his bedroom wall. Michael Jordan is the name Shaq always says first when people ask who scared him. Shaq has said it plainly, over and over, that Jordan was the only player who ever left him truly terrified on an NBA court. That fear did not come from Jordan's size. Jordan was not especially tall for a guard, and he was not close to Shaq's weight. The fear came from somewhere deeper. Shaq grew up in the 1980s watching Jordan on TV. He had Jordan posters on his wall. To a kid who dreamed about basketball, Jordan was not just a great player, he felt like something bigger than a person, almost like a legend that had somehow stepped off the screen and into real life. When Shaq got drafted first overall in 1992, he suddenly had to walk onto the same court as that legend. That is a strange kind of pressure. Most rookies are nervous about proving they belong in the league. Shaq was nervous about guarding someone he used to worship from a distance. He has described his rookie meeting with Jordan at the old Chicago Stadium in vivid detail. The building itself was built to intimidate visitors. There was a laser show before the game. There was loud, dramatic entrance music for the Bulls. The crowd was loud and pressing in from every direction. Then Jordan walked out with that look on his face, the stare that told every opponent he expected to win. Every part of that pregame show was designed to remind visiting teams exactly whose building they were standing in. Shaq has said his heart was pounding before the game even started. His hands were shaking, not because Jordan was going to hit him, not because Jordan was bigger or stronger. Shaq was shaking because the man walking toward him used to only exist on a TV screen and a bedroom wall, and now that same man was standing a few feet away, staring back at him like just another opponent to beat. This is Shaquille O'Neal we are talking about, a man who spent his whole career selling himself as unstoppable, as the most dominant player ever to touch a basketball. And by his own account, he once stood on an NBA court shaking before the ball was even in play. That single detail should make anyone rethink the idea that great athletes never feel fear. Shaq's fear did not come from Jordan's talent alone. It came from the belief that Jordan was more than human, a belief planted years earlier by a kid staring at a poster. The turning point came later in a live moment on defense. Jordan came off a screen and rose up for his jump shot. The shot he had hit against defender after defender for years, Shaq contested it. He nearly blocked it. In that one moment, something changed in Shaq's mind. He realized Jordan was not untouchable. Jordan was a great player, one of the best ever, but he was still a man who could miss a shot and still get challenged like anyone else. Once Shaq saw that, the paralyzing fear started to fade. He could compete instead of just standing in awe. That shift mattered on the scoreboard too. In 1995, Shaq's Orlando Magic eliminated Jordan's Chicago Bulls in the playoffs. the only team to beat Jordan's Bulls in a playoff series between 1991 and 1998. The very next year, in 1996, Chicago swept Orlando in the playoffs. A reminder that overcoming fear does not guarantee winning every rematch. Across their head-to-head history, Shaq's teams finished with a record of 9 wins and 12 losses against Jordan's teams. Shaq averaged 25.2 points and 13.2 rebounds in those games. Jordan averaged 28.7 points and 5.5 rebounds. These numbers do not mean the two players spent whole games guarding each other one-on-one, since they played different positions on different teams. What the numbers do show is a real, competitive rivalry, not a one-sided beating in either direction. It also proves that once Shaq stopped seeing Jordan as a myth and started seeing him as an opponent, he was able to hold his own on the biggest stages the league had to offer. What matters most about the Jordan story is not the stat line. It is the fact that Shaq, the man who tried to convince the entire league he feared nothing, has openly admitted that a poster on his childhood wall once made his hands shake on an NBA floor. That kind of honesty breaks the myth wide open before the video is even a third of the way through. And Jordan was not the only established star who made a young Shaq feel small. Just 1 year into his career, Shaq walked into one of the most famous arenas in the world and felt like a fraud standing next to a legend under the brightest lights in basketball. Patrick Ewing gave Shaq a completely different kind of fear, the fear of being humiliated in front of the whole country. This matchup happened early, during Shaq's rookie season, when Orlando played the New York Knicks at Madison Square Garden. Madison Square Garden is one of the most famous arenas in sports. Reporters from every major newspaper cover games there, and the fans inside are famous for being loud, harsh, and quick to turn on a player who looks unprepared. Ewing was already an established Knicks legend by that point, known around the league for a reliable jump hook and relentless competitive intensity on both ends of the floor. Shaq has admitted that before this specific game, he privately rated Ewing as a 10 and rated himself as only a 4. Think about that for a second. This is a young man built like a mountain, already being talked about as the next great center in the league, and in his own head he saw himself as barely half as good as the man across from him. That is not arrogance. That is fear, plain and simple. Part of that fear came from the setting itself. Shaq did not just worry about losing the game. He worried about what the newspapers would say the next morning. He worried about headlines describing how Patrick Ewing had made a fool out of the league's newest superstar. Headlines that would follow him into every arena for the rest of that rookie season. In a city like New York, with that many cameras and that many reporters, a bad night does not just disappear. It follows a player around for weeks, replayed on TV, printed in bold letters, and repeated by fans who remember a single rough game far longer than they remember a whole season of solid ones. Shaq lost the opening tip to Ewing. Then Ewing scored early on a short jumper, the same kind of shot that had beaten plenty of centers before him. In that moment, Shaq feared the entire game might slip away from him before he had a real chance to prove himself, and that fear had nothing to do with his legs or his lungs. It was entirely in his head. So what did he do? He put on a blank, unreadable face. He refused to let Ewing see any hint of doubt or worry on his expression. Inside, his mind might have been racing, but outside he looked calm. That is a defense mechanism plenty of nervous rookies use, hiding fear behind a mask of confidence they do not actually feel yet. The turning point in this matchup came when Shaq scored his own first basket over Ewing. He realized he could rise up high enough and create enough space with his body to get his own shot off cleanly. That one basket did more than add 2 points to the scoreboard. It told Shaq something important about his own future. If he could score over a player he considered a 10 while rating himself a 4, then maybe the gap between them was not as wide as he had believed walking into the building. Maybe one day, he could climb past centers like Ewing, instead of just surviving against them. A single made basket, something that happens dozens of times in every single NBA game, somehow carried enough weight to reset the confidence of a nervous 20-year-old rookie playing in front of a national audience. This story matters because it shows a very different Shaq than the one fans usually picture. His body already looked ready for the NBA. He was already huge, already powerful, already physically intimidating to grown men twice his age and experience. But his mind had not caught up yet. In his own head, he still saw himself as far below the league's established stars. His greatest fear that night was not getting physically hurt. It was public embarrassment, the kind that gets printed in bold letters the next morning. That tells us something important about the gap between Shaq's public image and his private thoughts. The dominant, fearless persona he later built for the cameras was, at least early on, partly a performance covering up real self-doubt underneath. Ewing attacked Shaq's confidence and his fear of public failure. The next player on this list attacked something different entirely: Shaq's emotional fuel tank, and forced him to find a strange new way to fill it. David Robinson created a problem that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with emotion. Robinson stood around 7'1", close to Shaq's own height, but he was built differently, more like a sculpted long-distance athlete than a bruiser with the kind of lean, chiseled frame that looked more suited to track and field than to banging under the basket. He could run the floor from one end to the other, almost like a smaller player sprinting from baseline to baseline in transition. And he had a soft, reliable mid-range shot that could pull a defender away from the basket entirely. In their early meetings, Robinson's speed and conditioning genuinely wore Shaq down physically. Chasing a 7-footer who moves like a guard for 48 minutes is exhausting, even for someone as strong as Shaq, and that constant motion forced Shaq to defend in space far more often than he preferred. But the deeper issue with Robinson was not physical stamina, it was emotional fuel. Shaq has said many times that he played his best basketball when he was angry, when he had built up some kind of personal grudge against the man in front of him. Anger gave him an extra gear, a level of force that made him even harder to handle underneath the basket. The problem with Robinson was that Robinson gave him nothing to be angry about. Robinson was polite. Robinson was respectful. Robinson carried himself with quiet class both on and off court, the kind of professional demeanor coaches usually praise young players for studying. There was no trash talk, no dirty plays, no attitude to latch onto and turn into fuel. In a strange way, that respect became a competitive obstacle for Shaq, almost the opposite problem most players face. He could not summon the same explosive aggression against someone he genuinely admired as a person, and admiration is not usually a word associated with fear, yet here it worked almost exactly the same way, holding him back at exactly the moment he needed to attack. So Shaq did something unusual. He invented a story. He claimed that when he was younger, Robinson had refused to give him an autograph in San Antonio. He repeated this story publicly for years, telling reporters and teammates about it, using it to manufacture a sense of rivalry and personal grievance that simply did not exist in real life. That invented slight gave him something to point to internally, a reason to play with an edge against a man he actually respected deeply. Years later, Shaq admitted directly to Robinson that the whole story had been made up from nothing. Think about what that confession really reveals. One of the most dominant, most confident competitors in NBA history needed to lie to himself just to reach his preferred emotional state on the court. His aggression was not always automatic. Sometimes it had to be manufactured out of thin air, built from nothing but imagination and pure competitive need. When a genuinely kind opponent refused to give him a villain to hate, Shaq built one out of pure imagination, and he kept that invented villain alive in his own head for years before finally letting it go. That is not the behavior of a man who feared nothing. That is the behavior of a man who understood his own psychology well enough to know he needed an enemy, even a fake one, to unlock his full aggression. The numbers between these two players show a real rivalry rather than one-sided domination. Their teams finished with an even record of 20 wins and 20 losses overall. In the playoffs, Shaq's teams held a 9-8 advantage. Shaq averaged around 27 points and 11.5 rebounds in these matchups. Robinson averaged around 20 points and 10 rebounds. Those are the numbers of two elite players pushing each other hard, not a lopsided beating in either direction. What stands out is not who won more games. It is the fact that Shaq needed to trick his own mind just to unlock the version of himself capable of competing at that level in the first place. Robinson forced Shaq to invent anger just to compete at his highest level. The next opponent on this list did not need Shaq to be angry at all. He simply outthought him, and the result humbled Shaq in a way that no amount of manufactured rage could fix. Hakeem Olajuwon delivered the sharpest blow to Shaq's sense of invincibility, and it happened on the biggest stage possible. Olajuwon never tried to overpower Shaq with pure strength. That was never his plan. Instead, he relied on footwork, timing, fakes, and a deep bag of counter moves that made defenders guess wrong over and over again. His signature set of post moves became so well known around the league that people simply called it the Dream Shake, a name that captured how a defender could be standing right in front of him, and still end up completely fooled. Before their careers turned into rivals, Shaq had actually trained with Olajuwon during some off-seasons, hoping to learn from one of the smartest post players the game had ever produced. That kind of off-season cooperation is common in basketball. Veterans often help younger players, passing down footwork and technique the way an older craftsman might train an apprentice. Shaq walked away from those sessions believing he had picked up a real understanding of Olajuwon's go-to moves. He felt prepared. He felt like he had studied the answer key ahead of the test, walking into the biggest series of his young career with a false sense of security that would soon be stripped away in front of the entire basketball world. Then came the 1995 NBA Finals, when Olajuwon's Houston Rockets swept Shaq's Orlando Magic in 4 straight games. During that series, Shaq realized something unsettling. Olajuwon had not shown him everything during those friendly off-season workouts. He had held back his sharpest counters, saving them for when it actually mattered on the sport's biggest stage, with a championship on the line. That is a gut punch on a completely different level than physical fear. It is the realization that someone you respected, someone you thought you understood, had been quietly outsmarting you the whole time, letting you believe you had an advantage that never actually existed. There is a specific kind of embarrassment that comes from being outsmarted rather than overpowered, and it lingers differently than a simple loss on the scoreboard. Shaq could outmuscle almost anyone in the league. He could not outmuscle a game plan he never saw coming. That defeat forced real change. Shaq spent the following years working to improve his post moves, adding strength and bulk to his frame, and sharpening his overall game so he could never be caught unprepared like that again on a championship stage. In many ways, that humbling sweep became one of the most important turning points of his entire career, even though it came from pure embarrassment rather than pride. Sometimes the losses that hurt the most end up shaping a career more than the wins do, and this was one of those moments for Shaq. The statistics from these two players tell an interesting story, depending on which years you look at. In regular season games across their careers, Shaq's teams held a 14-win to 6-loss advantage. Shaq averaged 22.1 points and 12.4 rebounds in those regular season meetings. Olajuwon averaged 18.4 points and 9.1 rebounds across that same regular season stretch. But the picture flips when you look at the playoffs specifically, where Olajuwon's teams went 5 wins to 3 losses against Shaq's teams. In the 1995 finals alone, Olajuwon averaged an incredible 32.8 points and 11.5 rebounds. An absolutely dominant individual performance against a much younger Shaq. In that same series, Shaq still averaged 28 points and 11.4 rebounds. Numbers that would normally look great, except his team still lost every single game. It is worth noting that Shaq's overall regular season numbers against Olajuwon improved in later years as Olajuwon got older and Shaq entered his physical prime, but that does not erase what happened in 1995, when both men were competing at the absolute peak of their powers. The final sweep is the story that matters here, because that is the moment when Shaq's belief in his own preparation completely collapsed. Hakeem beat him with a mind that Shaq could not fully map out, even after training beside him. That defeat should not be understood as one man beating Shaq entirely by himself, since basketball is a team sport and Houston's whole roster contributed to that sweep, but the personal lesson Shaq took from it was still deeply individual. He had entered that series believing he understood his opponent. He left it knowing he had only been shown part of the picture, the easier, friendlier part meant for a training session rather than a war for a championship. Hakeem exposed the difference between being the most physically dominant player on the floor and being the smartest one. Shaq's later growth deserves credit, but only after fully recognizing how badly that series exposed him at the time. It is a reminder that even the most physically gifted player in the world could still be caught completely unprepared by a mind working several steps ahead of his own. If Olajuwon beat Shaq with skill and hidden counters, the next 2 players on this list beat him in an entirely different way, by refusing to fight him where he was strongest at all. Rik Smits attacked a part of Shaq's game that raw power could never fix, the space away from the basket. Smits played center for the Indiana Pacers and earned the nickname the Flying Dutchman. He stood 7'4", taller than Shaq himself, with a soft touch that seemed almost gentle for a man that size, and a long, graceful stride that looked out of place on a player his height. His signature weapon was a smooth jump hook that he could release from either shoulder. But what really bothered Shaq was Smits' ability to step out to 15 or 18 feet and knock down a jump shot with a high, clean release that sailed right over Shaq's outstretched arms no matter how hard Shaq tried to contest it. Here's why that mattered so much. Shaq's biggest defensive strength was his presence right at the basket. Down low, near the rim, his size, strength, and reach made him nearly impossible to score over, since almost no player in the league could match his combination of length and power in that small amount of space. But Smits refused to play that game. He did not need to battle Shaq for position under the hoop, where every advantage belonged to Shaq anyway. He could simply catch the ball much farther out and release his shot before Shaq had time to close the distance, turning a mismatch in size into a mismatch in speed instead. That single tactical choice erased Shaq's biggest natural advantage before the possession even really began, and it forced Shaq into exactly the kind of perimeter defense he had never needed to master. Shaq has openly said that Smits caused him major problems in their early meetings. Exactly the kind of admission that does not fit the fearless, unstoppable image most fans hold of him. Shaq even suggested that if foot injuries had not limited Smits throughout his career, he might have remained one of the toughest matchups in the league for years longer than he actually did. A rare compliment from a player who rarely admitted another center gave him real trouble. Before facing Indiana in the 2000 NBA Finals, Shaq reportedly spent hours studying old game film specifically to prepare for Smits, planning to attack him early and aggressively before Smits could ever settle into a rhythm from the perimeter. That kind of extensive preparation for one specific opponent tells you everything about how seriously Shaq took this particular matchup. A champion does not spend hours watching film on a player he considers no threat at all. Part of the problem was structural, not personal. In basketball, a shooting big man forces the defense into an uncomfortable choice. If Shaq stayed home near the basket, Smits could simply shoot over him from the outside without any pressure at all. If Shaq stepped out to challenge the shot, he opened up space underneath the rim for other players to attack. There was no perfect answer, only a series of trade-offs, and Smits made sure Shaq felt every one of them, possession after possession, series after series, year after year. The overall numbers do lean heavily in Shaq's favor across their careers. Shaq's teams finished with a strong 15-win to 4-loss record in this matchup. Shaq averaged 28.2 points and 12.7 rebounds. Smits averaged 11.8 points and 4.7 rebounds. On the surface, those numbers look like a clear, one-sided advantage for Shaq. And in the long run, that is exactly what they show. But nervousness and statistical dominance are not always the same thing. Shaq could still finish a career series with a winning record, while genuinely dreading specific stretches inside individual games, especially early on before he had fully adjusted his approach. Smits forced Shaq to think, plan, and prepare in a way that pure strength alone could never solve, treating a routine regular season matchup like a puzzle that needed real study. A player who refused to stay in Shaq's preferred territory created real discomfort, even while losing the long-term numbers battle. And that discomfort mattered far more inside individual games than it does on a career stat sheet. If Smits forced Shaq to prepare and adjust, the next player on this list turned that same basic problem into Shaq's single most frustrating individual matchup of his entire career. Bryant Reeves might be the strangest name on this entire list, and that is exactly what makes his story so surprising. Most fans watching a highlight reel of Shaq's career would never even think to mention this name. And that is exactly the point. Reeves earned the nickname Big Country and played center for the Vancouver Grizzlies, standing about 7 feet tall and weighing roughly 275 pounds, a solid, broad frame, but nothing that should have troubled a player of Shaq's caliber on paper. What made Reeves so frustrating was his shot. He used an unusual high-release, one-handed jumper that Shaq himself described as an ugly, awkward-looking shot, similar in style to a much older player named Kevin Duckworth. It did not look pretty. It did not look like the kind of shot that should have given a dominant champion any trouble at all. The kind of jumper that coaches usually try to correct in young players rather than build a game plan around. But it kept going in, over and over, possession after possession, no matter how strange it looked leaving his hand. Here's how the tactical nightmare actually played out during games. Opposing point guards would run pick-and-roll plays using Reeves as the screener. Shaq's coaches instructed him to step out toward the ball handler in a defensive move often called a hedge, or a show, meant to slow down the guard before recovering back to his own man. That coverage makes sense against most centers, since most centers cannot punish the defense from that far away from the basket. The moment Shaq stepped out to hedge, Reeves would drift away from the basket, usually settling around 15 feet from the rim, wide open, exactly where his strange shot worked best. Because Shaq's massive frame made quick lateral recovery difficult, He simply could not get back out to Reeves fast enough, no matter how hard he tried to close the gap on each possession. Reeves would catch the ball, rise up with that odd-looking shot, and release it before Shaq ever arrived to contest it, turning what should have been an easy defensive stop into a wide-open look, time and time again. Shaq has specifically recalled looking at a halftime stat sheet during one of these games and seeing something that genuinely stunned him. He had scored 15 points. Reeves, the far less famous, far less celebrated player standing across from him, had scored 26. Picture that moment. One of the most dominant scorers of his entire generation staring down at a stat sheet at halftime, being outscored by more than 10 points by a player few casual fans could even name today. A player who never made an all-star team and never became a household name outside of Vancouver. That is not a story Shaq had to tell. He chose to tell it, publicly, because it captured just how helpless that specific matchup made him feel defensively, even while he was still producing solid numbers of his own on the other end. The full career numbers do favor Shaq by a wide margin. His teams finished with a dominant 12-win to 1-loss record. Shaq averaged 27.1 points and 11.4 rebounds. Reeves averaged 11.2 points and 8.3 rebounds. Those numbers make it clear that Shaq generally controlled this overall matchup, especially near the basket where his size advantage remained enormous. But this story was never really about who won the season series. It was about specific possessions, specific stretches inside specific games, where the league's most physically dominant player looked slow, confused, and completely unable to solve a much less talented shooter, simply because that shooter refused to fight him where he was strongest. Reeves exposed Shaq's recovery speed, his lateral quickness, and his general defensive discomfort, defending away from the paint, weaknesses that rarely showed up against traditional back-to-the-basket centers. Together, Smits and Reeves offer an important early lesson in basketball history. Teams eventually figured out they could not beat Shaq by trying to match his strength directly under the basket. Instead, they had to drag him away from it entirely. Shooting centers reduced his shot-blocking impact and pulled him out of his ideal rebounding position. These specific matchups, uncomfortable as they clearly were for Shaq at the time, were early hints of a stylistic shift that would eventually reshape the entire sport. As more and more teams began building rosters around big men who could shoot from the perimeter, this was not the single cause of that larger shift in basketball, but it stands as one clear, early example of the pattern beginning to form, years before floor spacing became the standard approach across the entire league. Every player discussed so far attacked Shaq above the waist, whether through emotion, skill, or shooting range. The final name on this list attacked him from somewhere else entirely, a place Shaq could barely even see. Muggsy Bogues is not one of the 6 main names on this list, but his story fits perfectly as a strange, unforgettable bonus example. At 5'3" and around 136 pounds, Bogues was the exact physical opposite of Shaquille O'Neal in almost every possible way, a full head and shoulders shorter than most starting point guards, let alone a 7-foot center. Where Shaq relied on overwhelming size, Bogues relied on speed, quickness, and positioning that most defenders never even considered, let alone a player used to looking down at almost everyone on the floor. Shaq's classic low-post offense depended heavily on rhythm dribbles, backing down a defender step by step while keeping control of the ball. Against most standard centers, this approach worked perfectly well, since Shaq could simply keep the ball up high, well out of reach of players his own size. Bogues changed that entire equation. The moment Shaq lowered the ball below waist level during one of his signature post moves, he entered a completely different danger zone, one that existed far below his own natural line of sight. Bogues could slip in low near Shaq's knees and strip the ball away before Shaq even realized he was there. Imagine focusing all your attention on a large physical defender standing directly in front of you, someone like Alonzo Mourning pressing into your back, while a much smaller player suddenly appears near your feet from an angle you never even considered. That is exactly the kind of situation Bogues created. It produced a very specific, very different kind of fear. Not fear of pain and not fear of public embarrassment, but a constant, nagging worry every single time the ball touched the floor near his feet. Looking back across this entire list, a clear pattern starts to emerge. Jordan attacked Shaq's deepest belief in his own place within the sport. Ewing attacked his confidence and his fear of public failure. Robinson attacked his emotional fuel source and forced him to manufacture anger from nothing. Hakeem attacked his understanding of the game itself, exposing gaps in preparation he never knew existed. Smits and Reeves attacked the space around him, dragging him away from the one area where his size mattered most. And Bogues, stranger than all the rest, attacked the one small blind spot located just beneath his own eyes. Shaquille O'Neal was never handed invincibility the moment he stepped onto an NBA court. His legendary status grew slowly, built on real fear, real mistakes, real embarrassment, and a genuine willingness to keep adjusting long after those uncomfortable nights ended. These admissions do not weaken his legacy in any way. If anything, they make his entire career feel more human and far more impressive once you understand the full picture. They also reveal exactly why the old idea of a completely fearless monster was never quite accurate to begin with. A large part of his greatness came from learning how to manage the very players and situations that once exposed his weaknesses in front of the whole world. Jordan eventually became human in Shaq's eyes once he saw him miss a contested shot. Ewing showed him in a single triumphant basket that he truly belonged among the league's elite big men. Robinson forced him to dig deep and manufacture emotional fuel from thin air just to compete at his highest level. Hakeem forced him to rebuild his game from the ground up after one humbling championship series. Smits and Reeves forced him to prepare, study, and think in ways that pure strength alone could never solve on its own. Even Bogues, standing barely over 5 feet tall, taught him to protect the basketball differently for the rest of his long and storied career. Shaq became an icon, not because fear never truly reached him, but because once it did, he usually found a way to grow bigger than it.